All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking those dry, dusty regulatory definitions and turning them into a high-stakes playbook. Our focus here is all about deep, core conceptual knowledge, but strictly for practical implementation. We're going to make sure you understand exactly what you can and absolutely cannot do to keep you out of trouble on the trading floor. Let's get right into it. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll compare roles, the doctor versus the pharmacist. Second, duties and service models. Third, appropriateness versus suitability. Then, benchmarks and investment styles. And finally, escalation and foreign risks.
Starting off with Section 1, Roles, Doctor versus Pharmacist.
Okay, so we're starting with the absolute foundation, which is your legal limits. And look, crossing the advisory line without the right authorization, that's a massive regulatory violation. We're talking career-ending stuff here. So think of the registered representative, the RR, as the doctor, right? A doctor diagnoses a problem, they prescribe a solution, and they give expert recommendations. Because they've done a full suitability check, they can take both solicited and unsolicited orders. On the flip side, you have the investment representative, or IR. They are the pharmacist. A pharmacist strictly fills the prescription, right? They execute unsolicited orders, they give factual market info, like quotes or prices, but they absolutely cannot give opinions. You cannot sway the patient.
So let's put this into practice. Imagine a client puts you on the spot and asks, hey, what do you think of XYZ stock? Should I buy it? Which registration type is legally allowed to answer that? Well, if you're an IR, the pharmacist, you have to freeze. You literally must transfer that call to an RR. Only the doctor is allowed to offer that kind of investment opinion.
Moving right along to Section 2, Duties and Service Models.
Let's look at how these individual roles actually fit into the broader legal service models you're going to encounter out there. What's really fascinating here is how clearly this maps out your escalating legal liability. On the far left, you've got order execution only, or OEO, completely self-directed. The client calls the shots, and the firm has absolutely zero suitability obligation for individual trades. In the middle, we have the advisory model. Here, the RR gives advice, but the client still holds the final say. This falls under a standard agency relationship of care and integrity. But then, on the far right, we hit discretionary management. This is where a portfolio manager executes trades without even calling the client first. And because of that massive level of power, it triggers the highest standard of care in the financial world, a strict fiduciary duty. That means absolute, undivided loyalty to the client.
Think about this scenario. A portfolio manager buys 200 shares at 10 a.m. for a client without calling them first. If you see an unapproved trade executing on the floor like that, you need to know instantly that this is only legal under a discretionary model. And it doesn't just happen on a whim either. It has to be strictly governed by a formally signed investment policy statement, or IPS, which dictates exactly what that manager is actually allowed to do.
All right, Section 3, Appropriateness versus Suitability.
So the crucial concept we really need to master next is how we approve accounts versus how we approve individual trades. These are distinct obligations, but they're deeply connected. It's easiest to think of the account itself as a container. Account appropriateness is essentially asking, is this container even right for the client? For example, you wouldn't put a total novice investor into a self-directed OEO container, right? You check this container once, right at the door. Suitability, on the other hand, is all about the contents going into the container. Are these specific investments right for the client? This is definitely not a one-and-done deal. You have to constantly monitor suitability ongoing for every single recommendation, especially when triggered by major life changes for your client.
But here's the catch. To figure out if those contents are suitable, you first have to satisfy KYP, Know Your Product. You have to deeply, fundamentally understand the specific traits of whatever you're dealing with. We're talking the structure, the features, the risks, the costs, like management expense ratios or loads, the liquidity, and of course, the tax treatment. And that brings us to this absolute golden rule. You cannot recommend what you don't understand. This is a core principle you'll see on CRO exams. Basically, suitability is literally impossible if you haven't mastered KYP first. I mean, if you don't know the risks and costs inside and out, how could you possibly know if it's the right fit for your client's portfolio? You can't.
Let's look at a practical scenario. An OEO, a self-directed client, enters a highly risky, just terribly awful trade all by themselves. Do you have a suitability obligation to jump in and stop them? Actually, no. Remember our container analogy? In an order execution only container, the client is entirely assuming the risk. The firm is legally exempt from suitability on individual contents. You do not step in simply because no advice is being given. They're on their own.
Which leads us to Section 4, Benchmarks and Investment Styles. Okay, so once you understand the container and the contents, you've got to know how to actually measure the performance of those investments. Otherwise, you can't speak intelligently to your clients. And look, your clients are going to pay vastly different fees depending on their manager's style. On one hand, passive management just wants to index, literally just match the market. Since it's a super simple buy and hold approach, the costs, the MERs, are incredibly low. Active management, though, that involves highly paid managers trying to actively beat the market through intense research and market timing. And because they are out there hunting for outperformance, they charge a much higher premium for it. So if you're going to recommend an expensive active fund, you are hunting for alpha. Alpha is essentially the holy grail of active management. Mathematically speaking, it's the manager's return minus the benchmark return. It's the proof of the manager's skill, showing exactly how much they beat their specific benchmark by.
Let's look at how this math works in practice. Rule number 1, you never, ever judge a 9% return in a vacuum. If a client is bragging, hey, I made 9% this year, but the market benchmark made 7%, well, you just subtract that benchmark from the manager's return and boom, you find your 2% alpha. That 2% is the pure, actual value the manager added. The rest was just the market going up.
But to calculate that alpha accurately, you absolutely have to memorize these exact benchmarks so you're comparing apples to apples. You're going to use the S&P/TSX Composite for Canadian stocks, the FTSE Canada Universe for Canadian bonds, and the S&P 500 for U.S. equities. Notice the S&P 500 is not a Canadian benchmark. And if you have a balanced fund, let's say 60% stocks and 40% bonds, you have to use a blended benchmark to match it perfectly.
And finally, Section 5, Escalation and Foreign Risks. For our final topic, we really need to talk about survival, specifically recognizing when a situation is totally beyond your legal capacity and requires immediate escalation. Because trust me, in this industry, doing nothing is just not an option. If a client throws any of these red flags your way, you escalate. Period. Whether they want to trade complex products like options outside your competency, or they're asking for crazy complex tax planning, requesting discretionary trading you aren't licensed for, or even handing you a verbal power of attorney without verified legal docs, you stop. And most importantly, if you see any signs of financial exploitation or diminished capacity, doing nothing is a massive violation. You have to escalate.
Now, this is perhaps the highest risk pitfall for new advisors to remember. You work so hard to get this CIRE license, but you have to realize one harsh reality. Your authority stops dead at the Canadian border.
The exact moment a client steps into another country, you are suddenly tangled up in foreign securities laws. The U.S. is by far the highest risk because of the overlapping SEC and IRS regimes. On top of that, FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, requires you to identify and report any U.S. persons. We're talking citizens or green card holders, regardless of where they actually live right now. You can literally never assume a Canadian living in the States or a U.S. citizen living here can just be serviced normally.
So I'll leave you with this final compounding dilemma to ponder for your exams and your everyday practice. A client tells you they are moving to the U.S. next week, but they want to execute a complex, unfamiliar options trade right now, today. What is your exact next move? When faced with a foreign move that requires immediate escalation, plus a complex product you don't understand that also requires immediate escalation, will you know to freeze and alert compliance before hitting that execution button? Master your boundaries, know your products, and you'll thrive on the floor. Thanks for joining this explainer.